Psycho Karen stole my honey, so I let the bees teach her a lesson. Maybe it all started with a simple misunderstanding, or perhaps it was just Karen being Karen. You know the type, always ready with a complaint, always watching, always finding fault. But little did I know that her constant nitpicking would eventually push me to the brink. Let me paint you a picture of life in our quaint little neighborhood before everything went sideways. Picture perfect houses with manicured lawns, the kind of place where everyone knows your name. Well, almost everyone. Karen moved in about a year ago, and from day one, she made it clear she wasn't here to make friends. At first, it was small things. A passive-aggressive note about my grass being half an inch too long, a snide comment about the color I chose to paint my fence. But as the weeks turned into months, Karen's behavior became increasingly erratic and invasive. She'd stand at her window for hours, binoculars in hand, scrutinizing my every move. Heaven forbid I so much as sneezed in my own backyard. Within minutes, she'd be on the phone to the homeowners association, claiming I was spreading disease. But it was my beekeeping that really set her off. The day I installed my first hive, you'd have thought I'd unleashed a plague upon the neighborhood. Karen was at my door within minutes, red-faced and practically foaming at the mouth. "Those things are dangerous," she screeched, jabbing a finger in my face. "They'll sting our children. They'll ruin our property values." I tried to reason with her. I explained the importance of bees to our ecosystem, how they were docile creatures that rarely stung unless provoked. I even offered to give her some of the honey once the hive was established. But Karen wasn't interested in facts or peace offerings. She was on a mission, and that mission was to make my life a living hell. The complaints to the HOA came fast and furious. The noise from the bees was disturbing her sleep. The scent of the hives was aggravating her allergies. My beekeeping equipment was an eyesore. When the HOA refused to take action, Karen escalated. She started calling the police, claiming my bees were aggressive and out of control. Of course, when the officers arrived, they found nothing but a well-maintained hive and a very confused beekeeper. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting started. She began leaving flyers on our neighbors' doors, warning them about the bee menace in their midst. She created a Facebook group dedicated to getting me and my killer insects out of the neighborhood. I tried to keep my cool. I really did. But as the weeks wore on, I could feel my patience wearing thin. The constant harassment, the dirty looks, the whispered comments when I walked by, it was all starting to take its toll. And then came the day that pushed me over the edge. I returned home from work to find my hive in disarray, honey frames scattered across the yard. At first, I thought it might have been vandals or perhaps a particularly determined bear. But then I saw it. A strand of bleach blonde hair caught on one of the frames, Karen's hair. As I stood there surveying the destruction, something inside me snapped. The months of harassment, the sleepless nights, the constant stress, it all came bubbling to the surface. I knew I couldn't retaliate directly. That would only give Karen more ammunition. No, I needed to be smarter. I needed to let karma, or in this case nature, take its course. And that's when I had an idea. An idea so wild, so potentially disastrous, that I almost dismissed it outright. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the perfect solution. If Karen wanted bees so badly, well, who was I to deny her? Little did I know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change our quiet little neighborhood forever. But before we get into that, I have to ask, what would you have done in my situation? Have you ever dealt with a neighbor from hell? Let me know in the comments below. Now, buckle up, because things are about to get interesting. And when I say interesting, I mean the kind of interesting that involves thousands of angry bees and one very surprised Karen. But don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, you might be wondering how I ended up in this situation in the first place. Well, let me take you back a bit. I've always been fascinated by bees. There's something magical about these tiny creatures that work tirelessly to keep our world blooming. I started beekeeping as a hobby about 5 years ago, but it quickly grew into something more. My little apiary, nestled in the corner of my backyard, became my sanctuary. I'd spend hours watching the bees come and go, marveling at their intricate social structure and the sweet golden honey they produced. Before long, I was selling that honey at local farmers markets, and let me tell you, people couldn't get enough of it. Our neighborhood used to be the kind of place you'd see in those cheesy real estate commercials. You know the ones: perfect lawns, white picket fences, neighbors waving to each other as they collect their morning papers. My apiary fit right in, a little slice of nature in our suburban paradise. But then Karen moved in, and suddenly, our little utopia wasn't so perfect anymore. At first, her complaints were almost comical. She'd call the HOA because my grass was a shade too green, claiming it made her lawn look bad. She'd complain about the birds chirping too loudly in the morning, as if I had some sort of avian volume control. But when she set her sights on my bees, things took a turn for the worse. "Those bees are a menace," she'd screech, storming up to my door at least once a week. "They're dive-bombing my petunias. They're chasing away my cat. I'm allergic, you know. One sting, and I could die." Now, I'm no medical expert, but I'm pretty sure Karen's allergy was about as real as her natural hair color. But facts didn't matter to Karen. She was on a crusade, and my bees were public enemy number one. The complaints escalated. She started calling the city, claiming my apiary violated zoning laws. She'd stand at the edge of her property, just inches from the property line, glaring at my hives and muttering under her breath. Once I caught her trying to spray my bees with what looked suspiciously like insecticide. But the final straw? That came on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. I was in my backyard, tending to my hives, when I heard a commotion. I looked up to see Karen, in all her bleach blonde glory, marching towards me with a piece of paper clutched in her hand like a weapon. "I've got you now," she crowed, waving the paper in my face. "This is a petition signed by everyone in the neighborhood. We want your bees gone, or we'll take legal action." I snatched the paper from her hand, my heart pounding, but as I scanned the document, I couldn't help but laugh. The only signature on the petition was Karen's own, written over and over in different colored pens. As I handed the paper back to her, I saw something in Karen's eyes that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just anger or frustration, it was pure, unadulterated malice. "This isn't over," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "One way or another, I'm going to get rid of those bees, and if you get in my way, I'll get rid of you too." As I watched Karen storm back to her house, I couldn't help but wonder, how far would she really go to disrupt my livelihood? And more importantly, what was I prepared to do to stop her? Little did I know, the answer to both those questions would come sooner than I expected, and in a way that would change everything. But before we get into that, I'm curious, have you ever had to deal with a neighbor like Karen? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this wild ride so far, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories. Now, let's dive into what happened next. Because believe me, things were about to get a whole lot crazier. The morning after Karen's threat, I woke up early, eager to check on my bees. As I approached the hives, something felt off. The usual buzz of activity was muted, and there was a strange scent in the air that didn't belong. My heart sank as I got closer. Several of my hives had been opened, frames scattered on the ground. But it wasn't just the destruction that horrified me, it was what was missing. My prized honey, gallons of it, carefully harvested and ready for the farmer's market that weekend, was gone. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, something caught my eye. There, stuck to one of the broken frames, was a long strand of bleach blonde hair, Karen's calling card. I felt a wave of emotions wash over me: shock, disbelief, and then a white-hot anger that made my vision blur. This wasn't just about the honey anymore. This was about my livelihood, my passion, and the countless hours of work I'd poured into my apiary. My first instinct was to call the police, but as I reached for my phone, I hesitated. What proof did I have, really? A strand of hair that could have come from any bottle blonde in the neighborhood? I knew Karen, she'd twist this around, maybe even accuse me of framing her. No, the legal route wouldn't work. Not with Karen. She'd already shown she was willing to lie, cheat, and now steal to get her way. I needed to think outside the box. That's when an idea started to form. A crazy, potentially disastrous idea that made a small part of me wonder if I was losing my mind. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like poetic justice. Karen wanted my bees gone? Fine. She'd get to experience them up close and personal. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I moved several of my hives closer to the property line, right where I knew Karen liked to stand and glare at my yard. I made sure the hives were agitated, not enough to cause real harm, but enough to make their presence known. As the sun began to set, I took a deep breath and put my plan into action. I carefully opened the hives, just enough to let the bees know there was a potential threat nearby. Then, I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, I heard Karen's familiar screech from next door. "What's that buzzing? What have you done?" I could hear her stomping around her yard, her voice rising in pitch as she realized she was surrounded by very unhappy bees. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt, but then I remembered my destroyed hives, my stolen honey, and months of harassment. As Karen's yells turned to panic screams, I couldn't help but wonder, would the bees deliver the justice I sought? Had I gone too far in seeking retribution? I stood there, listening to the chaos next door, torn between satisfaction and worry. What would happen next? How would this change things in our neighborhood? And most importantly, had I just made a terrible mistake? But before we get into the aftermath of my bee-based revenge, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been pushed to the point of taking matters into your own hands? How did it turn out? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you're on the edge of your seat wondering what happened next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion to this unbelievable tale. The aftermath of Karen's encounter with my bees was, well, let's just say it was as dramatic as you might expect. I heard the sirens before I saw the flashing lights. Within minutes, our quiet street was filled with police cars, an ambulance, and what seemed like half the neighborhood, all gathered to watch the spectacle. Karen was a sight to behold. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a mess, her designer outfit covered in dirt and grass stains. She was waving her arms wildly, pointing at my house and screeching about killer bees and attempted murder. As the paramedics checked her over, she was fine, just a few stings and a badly bruised ego. I noticed something interesting. Our neighbors, the same ones who had been giving me sideways glances for weeks thanks to Karen's rumor mill, were now looking at her with expressions ranging from amusement to outright disgust. But the real kicker came when Mr. Peterson, the retired lawyer from down the block, stepped forward. "I saw something interesting earlier today," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I was out for my evening walk when I saw Karen here sneaking out of our beekeeper friend's yard. She was carrying something heavy. It looked like jars of honey to me." Karen's face went from red to white faster than I thought possible. She started sputtering denials, but it was too late. The police, who had been eyeing her suspiciously throughout all of this, now had probable cause. Long story short, Karen was arrested that night, not for stealing my honey, though that charge would come later, but for filing false police reports. Turns out, all those calls she'd made about my aggressive bees were considered misuse of emergency services. As for me, well, I got a stern talking to from the police about bee safety, but no charges. Most of my neighbors, now seeing Karen for who she really was, apologized for believing her lies. Some even offered to help me rebuild my damaged hives. In the weeks that followed, as the legal system dealt with Karen, community service, and a hefty fine, if you're curious, I had a lot of time to reflect on what had happened. Had I gone too far? Was letting my bees loose on Karen, even indirectly, the right thing to do? On one hand, it felt good to see Karen face consequences for her actions. Her reign of terror over the neighborhood was over, and my bees were safe. But on the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder if I had stooped to her level by seeking revenge. In the end, I suppose the bees delivered their own form of justice. They defended their home, just as I had tried to defend mine against Karen's constant attacks. Was it fair? I'm still not sure. But it certainly was effective. So, I'll leave you with this question. Was this a fair resolution, or did I go too far? What would you have done in my situation? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, the next time you're dealing with a difficult neighbor, maybe think twice before you mess with a beekeeper, because sometimes karma stings. As the dust settled on the Great Bee Incident, as our neighborhood came to call it, I found myself reflecting on the lessons learned. First and foremost, I realized the importance of community. When push came to shove, my neighbors stood by me, proving that truth and decency can prevail over malice and lies. It reinforced the value of building good relationships, even in the face of adversity. Surprisingly, this whole fiasco actually boosted my beekeeping business. The local news picked up the story, And suddenly, everyone wanted to buy honey from the beekeeper who stood up to the neighborhood menace. I even started offering beekeeping classes, teaching others about these fascinating creatures and their importance to our ecosystem. The neighborhood dynamics shifted too. People started talking to each other more, looking out for one another. We organized a community garden, and guess who the star pollinators were? Yep, my bees. So, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. Don't underestimate the power of knowledge and community. Learn about beekeeping, or whatever it is that interests you. Get to know your neighbors. And if conflicts arise, try to resolve them peacefully. But remember, sometimes nature has its own way of balancing the scales. Before we wrap up, I want to encourage you all to look into beekeeping or local conservation efforts. These little creatures play a huge role in our world, and they need our help. And remember, the next time life hands you a Karen, make honey. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories.